Hello, my name is Scott and welcome to a very special series of Heroes Among Us. This is something of an experiment, a story told in several episodes, but it isn't just any story. It's one that's very near and dear to my heart. You've heard me say before that my dad, Elmer Robbie Robinson, is my hero. This story is one of the reasons why. It took place in the North Atlantic on Christmas Eve of 1943. Every Christmas Eve when I was growing up, my dad would retell the story. Over the years, it became part of my life. And as I got older, I began to understand the bone-chilling fear that he and his shipmates faced that night. He was just 22 years old. Most of the men in this story were like him, young, many fresh out of high school, who answered the call of their country. My dad and his shipmates, including the survivors of that horrific night, have all since passed. But I made them a promise back in the 1990s that I would keep their story alive. They are the heroes among us. This is a story of Task Group 2114, the Forgotten Convoy, and the night we lost the USS Leary DD-158. Behind me is a flag that flew on the USS Schenck DD-159 during World War II. It flew for only 2 weeks, and you can see the damage from the weather at sea. On Christmas Eve of 1943, this flag was there. It flew over men who faced fear, chaos, and death in the North Atlantic. For me, this isn't just history. My dad, Robbie, was the radio man aboard the Schenck that night. Many of the survivors became my friends. In the 1990s, I had the honor of helping bring the crews of the Schenck and Leary together for their final reunions. At one of those reunions, the veterans entrusted me with that flag. They asked me to carry their memory forward for future generations and to tell their story. So beginning tonight, I share it with you. This is a story of that flag, my father, ordinary men who became heroes, and a fateful Christmas Eve in 1943. By late 1943, the crews of the Leary and Schenck had already seen the horrors of the Atlantic War. They had escorted convoys, long columns of merchant ships heavy with men, oil, food, and ammunition across the U-boat-infested and storm-tossed North Atlantic. Convoys were lifelines. Britain depended on them. The Allied armies depended on them. Freedom depended on them. And the U-boats hunted them relentlessly. For many sailors, the worst memories weren't of fighting the U-boats, but of watching helplessly as merchant ships were struck. A flash on the horizon, an explosion, and then men, friends, strangers, fellow seamen thrown into the freezing waters with little chance of survival. Those sights haunted the convoys, and they haunted the men who now sailed under this American flag. On December 24, 1943, the Schenck and the Leary were not with a supply convoy. That night, they sailed as part of Task Group 2114, a hunter-killer group centered on the escort carrier USS Card, CVE-11. The Card launched aircraft to patrol the Atlantic skies, while destroyers like Schenck and Leary formed the screen, all searching for U-boats and protecting the carrier itself. But at night, aircraft couldn't fly. The task group was virtually blind, and that's when the German U-boats stalked their prey. However, the small and outdated destroyers carried something new. Leary was the first U.S. destroyer fitted with both radar and sonar. In theory, that made her a deadly submarine hunter. The Schenck was also fitted with this new technology. Both ships were also fitted with another new technology, high-frequency direction-finding equipment. The sailors nicknamed the device Huff Duff. This device allowed the ships to home in on enemy radio transmissions. But even with all this new technology, the truth was harsh. The U-boats still held the advantage, stealth. And Christmas Eve of 1943 would prove it. On the Leary, sailors like Bud and Sandy pushed thoughts of home aside, their families, their sweethearts, Christmas dinners they would never taste. On the Schenck, my father Robbie sat at his radio set, writing his wife, my mom. He told her of the harsh conditions at sea, of ships being sunk, and hearing the heart-wrenching pleas for help over the radio. Headphones were pressed tight, static and voices mingling in his ears. The pounding of the seas against the steel echoed throughout the ship. The men were tired. They were cold. They were scared. They were patriots. And none of them knew that a wolf pack of German U-boats, 9 submarines, codenamed Wolfpack Borkum, was already closing in. The seas were brutal. Spray froze to the rails, turning steel into ice. The winds cut through every layer of clothing. In the mess decks, the men ate what they could. The sea was so rough that proper meals couldn't be cooked, and cold rations, lukewarm coffee was the only sustenance. Talk of home was non-existent. In the radio room aboard the Schenck, where my dad was, they used a bucket to relieve themselves. It was too dangerous to try and make it aft across the icy deck to the head. The seas were so rough they had to buckle themselves into their seats. These were the harrowing conditions that we as a nation asked our young men to face. On the bridge, officers scanned radar screens, watching for the blips of a surfaced U-boat. The soundman listened to his hydrophones for the sound of a U-boat's engines. The sonar man listened to the return ping of the sonar. Lookouts scanned the dark seas for a silhouette. Tension was thick. The stress was just unimaginable. Above them all, the Schenck's flag snapped in the brutal North Atlantic wind, its edges becoming tattered, its colors darkened by the soot from the smokestacks. A symbol of endurance, heroism, hope, and of the young men who stood beneath it. The USS Card was about 10 miles distant. The storm had caused an airplane to break loose from her deck and fall overboard. Another missed the flight deck and crashed into the sea. Battered, she made her best way to the safety of the Azores. Another destroyer, the USS Babbitt, had lost its ability to steer, and men were on deck with huge hawsers fighting the seas to keep her in control. They lashed themselves to the rails to keep from being washed overboard. She would not be able to assist that night with anti-submarine duties and had to make her best way with Card to the safety in the Azores. Leary was 6 miles distant from Schenck. Conditions were so bad that Card radioed the Schenck and Leary with an ominous message. "You're on your own. Do best to keep the subs down during the night. Rendezvous in the morning. Good luck." Conditions were bad. The dice had been cast, and deep beneath the waves, German captains whispered orders. Torpedo tubes flooded, targets locked. The wolves had moved into striking range. And within hours, steel would meet steel. The North Atlantic was more than a battlefield. It was an enemy of its own, one that swallowed men, ships, and memories without mercy. Join us for our next episode. Please like and subscribe, and join me as we continue the saga of 21.14, The Forgotten Convoy, the night we lost the USS Leary. Out.